The birthday cake crumbled at exactly 4:23 p.m., its pristine white frosting mixing with crimson as it hit the dusty wooden floor of the ranch house. In the sweltering kitchen below, Tavira Morwenne watched through the serving window as Colorado Territory's most powerful cattle barons writhed in their finest Sunday clothes, their screams echoing across the prairie wind. This is the story of how one enslaved woman turned a celebration into a graveyard, and why her recipe for vengeance would poison the conscience of the entire frontier for decades to come. The year was 1852, and the Thornwick Ranch stood like a fortress against the endless Colorado sky. What the birthday guests didn't know was that their trusted kitchen maid had spent months perfecting a different kind of recipe, one that would transform pest poison into the deadliest dessert the American West had ever tasted. When justice comes served on fine china, and the cook knows more about chemistry than anyone suspects, dinner becomes the final meal that some will ever enjoy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The screams began at exactly 4:25 p.m., 2 minutes after Eryndor Valecrest took his first bite of the three-tiered masterpiece that was meant to celebrate his 45th birthday. The cake's delicate vanilla layers, adorned with hand-piped roses and golden sugarwork, now lay scattered across the hewn pine floors of the Thornwick Ranch dining hall, like the remnants of a shattered dream. Tavira Morwenne stood motionless in the kitchen doorway, her calloused hands still dusted with flour, watching as Colorado Territory's most influential cattle ranchers and territorial officials convulsed in their finest Eastern imported clothing. The irony wasn't lost on her that these men, who had built their fortunes on the backs of the enslaved and the dispossessed, were now experiencing their own form of helplessness. Judge Malvin Caraith, recently appointed to oversee territorial law, was the first to collapse completely. His ornate waistcoat, a symbol of the civilization he claimed to represent in this frontier wilderness, was now stained with the contents of his stomach, as his body rejected the elegant refreshments he'd been praising moments before. The territorial governor's representative, Dravan Thorsell, followed shortly after, his political ambitions cut short by what appeared to be the most exquisite birthday celebration the Colorado frontier had ever witnessed. The dining hall, which had been filled with the sound of masculine laughter and discussions of cattle prices, railroad expansion, and the profitable business of human bondage, now echoed with something far more primal. These were the sounds of men who had never known true vulnerability, discovering what it meant to be powerless, to have their fate determined by forces beyond their control. Tavira had spent 23 years perfecting the art of invisibility, moving through this world like a ghost whose only purpose was to serve the comfort and convenience of those who owned her body, her time, and her future. But invisibility, she had learned, was a form of power. When people don't see you, they don't guard themselves against you. When they dismiss your intelligence, they reveal their own weaknesses. When they treat you as furniture, you observe everything. The Thornwick Ranch dining hall represented the pinnacle of frontier luxury. Crystal glasses imported from Boston caught the afternoon light, streaming through windows that offered views of endless prairie grassland. The mahogany table, hauled by ox cart across 1,000 miles of wilderness, could seat 24 guests in comfort that rivaled anything found in Denver or even St. Louis. Persian rugs covered floors made from timber that had been floated down the Arkansas River, while oil paintings of pastoral scenes created the illusion of genteel civilization in a land where justice was still administered by rope and rifle. The birthday celebration had drawn the territory's elite from settlements scattered across hundreds of miles of Colorado wilderness. These were men who controlled cattle herds numbering in the thousands, who determined which areas would be developed and which would remain frontier, who decided the fate of native tribes and enslaved people with equal casual indifference. Their carriages and riding parties had converged on Thornwick Ranch like a gathering of medieval lords, ready to celebrate another year of profitable exploitation disguised as progress. But now their celebration had transformed into something that would be whispered about in frontier settlements for decades to come. The pest poison that Tavira had carefully extracted and refined over months of patient work was accomplishing in minutes what years of pleading, reasoning, and hoping had failed to achieve. These men were learning that their assumed superiority was an illusion that could be shattered by knowledge they'd never bothered to acquire and wisdom they'd consistently dismissed. The birthday cake had been her masterpiece in more ways than one. 3 layers of the finest vanilla cake made with flour transported from Kansas mills and eggs from the ranch's prized hens. The frosting was a marvel of frontier baking, smooth as silk and white as fresh snow, decorated with roses that had taken her hours to pipe with the precision of an artist. But beneath that perfect exterior lay an ingredient that would transform celebration into catastrophe, birthday joy into final judgment. Eryndor Valecrest, the master of Thornwick Ranch and the man whose birthday they were celebrating, was experiencing the effects more slowly than his guests. His larger frame and robust constitution meant that the poison would take longer to accomplish its work, giving him time to understand what was happening, to realize that his trusted kitchen maid possessed knowledge and capabilities that he'd never imagined. The recognition in his eyes, when it finally came, would be worth every risk she'd taken to reach this moment. The territorial officials and visiting ranchers were dropping like wheat before a harvester's blade. Their fine clothes, their political connections, their economic power meant nothing when faced with the equalizing force of chemistry applied with precision and intent. Money couldn't purchase immunity from the consequences of their actions. Political influence couldn't override the biological processes that were now shutting down their systems one by one. The sound of splintering wood filled the air as men fell against furniture that had been crafted to display wealth and status. Crystal glasses shattered as trembling hands lost their grip. The silver serving pieces, polished to mirror brightness, reflected the chaos that was consuming the room like a spreading fire. Even the hunting trophies mounted on the walls seemed to watch with glassy-eyed approval as the hunters became the hunted. This was the moment Tavira had been planning for 8 months, ever since the day that changed everything between her and the man whose birthday cake would be his last meal. The day she discovered that some forms of justice can't be dispensed by courts or law enforcement, that sometimes the oppressed must create their own courtroom and serve their own verdict. The kitchen had become her laboratory, baking had become her weapon, and this birthday celebration had become her tribunal. The year 1852 found the Colorado Territory balanced on the knife's edge between wilderness and civilization, where territorial ambitions clashed with the realities of frontier life like storm fronts meeting over the endless prairie. This was a land where buffalo herds still darkened the horizon for days at a time, where native tribes fought desperate battles to preserve their ancestral grounds, and where men like Eryndor Valecrest carved empires from grassland and ambition. The Thornwick Ranch sprawled across 40,000 acres of some of the finest grazing land between the Missouri River and the Rocky Mountains. Its boundaries encompassed 3 natural water sources, a crucial advantage in a territory where water rights determined the difference between prosperity and bankruptcy. The main ranch house, constructed from limestone quarried in Kansas and timber floated down from mountain forests, stood like a monument to Eastern sensibilities imposed upon Western wilderness. The ranch operated as more than an agricultural enterprise. It functioned as the economic and political center for a region that stretched from the Arkansas River to the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Eryndor Valecrest's influence extended into territorial politics, railroad planning, and the complex negotiations surrounding statehood. His correspondence with officials in Washington carried weight that affected the futures of thousands of people who would never know his name. But the foundation of this empire rested upon the labor of people who had no choice in their participation. Tavira was one of 17 enslaved people who worked the ranch, their legal status made possible by congressional compromises that allowed slavery to exist in territories where local populations would determine its future. The Compromise of 1850 had left Colorado's status deliberately ambiguous, creating a gray area that men like Valecrest exploited with ruthless efficiency. The isolation of frontier life meant that the normal oversight mechanisms of more established regions simply didn't exist. There were no abolitionist societies monitoring conditions, no northern newspapers investigating working arrangements, no federal officials conducting regular inspections. The nearest territorial judge was a 3-day ride away, and that judge, Malvin Coraith, happened to own interests in several ranching operations himself. This remoteness created opportunities for both exploitation and resistance that would have been impossible in more populated areas. Masters could exercise absolute authority without external interference, but that same isolation meant that acts of rebellion might go undetected until their effects were irreversible. The vastness of the territory offered escape routes that didn't exist in the settled East, but it also meant that help was equally distant for those who needed it. The ranch's workforce consisted of a carefully balanced combination of enslaved labor, hired hands, and seasonal workers. The enslaved people handled the domestic work, livestock care, and specialized tasks that required year-round commitment. The hired hands, mostly drifters and men running from various troubles, provided the muscle for cattle drives and heavy construction. The seasonal workers arrived during roundup and branding seasons, when the work demanded more hands than the permanent staff could provide. This mixing of different labor systems created complex social dynamics that shaped daily life on the ranch. The hired hands occupied a middle position between the enslaved workers and the owner class, their freedom limited by economic dependence but not by legal bondage. Some harbored sympathetic attitudes toward the enslaved workers, while others jealously guarded their marginal advantages and sometimes proved more brutal than the masters themselves. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The nearest settlement, Copper Creek, consisted of a trading post, a blacksmith shop, 2 saloons, and a handful of businesses that served the surrounding ranches. It was here that news from the outside world arrived sporadically, carried by traders, military couriers, and the occasional newspaper that might be weeks out of date. The information that reached Thornwick Ranch was filtered through multiple layers of interpretation and bias, creating a distorted view of national events that served the interests of those who controlled the information flow. Railroad surveying parties had been crossing the territory for 2 years, mapping routes that would eventually connect the mineral wealth of the mountains with the markets of the East. The arrival of rail transportation would transform the entire region, making large-scale cattle operations more profitable, while also increasing federal oversight and bringing new populations with different attitudes towards slavery. The territorial government, such as it was, operated from temporary facilities in various settlements, its authority extending only as far as the willingness of local strongmen to acknowledge it. Real power lay with ranch owners like Valecrest, who commanded private armies of hired guns and controlled resources that territorial officials needed for their own survival. This feudal arrangement meant that justice was dispensed according to the interests of property owners rather than any abstract principles of law or morality. Native tribes still controlled vast areas of the territory, though their influence was waning as disease, warfare, and ecological destruction took their toll. The relationship between ranchers and tribal communities was complex, involving elements of trade, diplomacy, and intermittent warfare. Some tribes had adapted to the changing circumstances by entering into agreements with ranchers, while others continued to resist the encroachment of white settlement. The climate of the region shaped everything from daily routines to long-term planning. Winters could be brutal, with blizzards that isolated the ranch for weeks at a time. Summers brought heat, drought, and the constant threat of prairie fires that could destroy months of work in a matter of hours. The growing season was short, making self-sufficiency in food production a constant challenge that required careful planning and skillful management. This was the world that Tavira navigated daily, a place where survival depended on understanding the unwritten rules that governed relationships between different groups. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated changing moods, shifting alliances, and emerging opportunities. The isolation that protected her masters from external scrutiny also provided her with the privacy needed to develop skills and knowledge that they never suspected she possessed. The kitchen where she worked was the nerve center of ranch operations, the place where information converged and decisions were made. She heard conversations about cattle prices, railroad negotiations, political developments, and business partnerships that shaped the future of the entire region. This intelligence, combined with her growing understanding of chemistry and botany, would prove to be a combination more dangerous than any weapon the frontier had ever seen. Tavira Morwenne possessed a mind that could calculate complex ratios for cooking large meals, while simultaneously cataloging the botanical properties of every plant growing within a 50-mile radius of Thornwick Ranch. At 26 years old, she had spent the last 8 years as head cook for the ranch, a position that granted her certain privileges while subjecting her to scrutiny that would have broken weaker spirits. Her reputation as the finest cook in Colorado Territory was well established among the ranching elite. Visitors to Thornwick Ranch would spend their return journeys discussing Tavira's culinary innovations, her ability to transform frontier ingredients into dishes that rivaled anything served in the finest restaurants of St. Louis or Chicago. What they didn't understand was that cooking was merely the most visible application of a much broader set of skills. Tavira could identify edible plants at distances that amazed even experienced frontiersmen. She understood fermentation processes that allowed her to preserve foods through harsh winters when supply wagons couldn't reach the ranch. Her knowledge of herbs and their properties meant that she served as unofficial physician to the ranch's entire population, treating everything from minor cuts to serious illnesses with remedies that she prepared herself. The source of her botanical knowledge was Eryndor Valecrest, an elderly Cherokee woman who had been purchased by Valecrest specifically for her medical skills. Eryndor had spent years teaching Tavira the traditional uses of native plants, lessons that were conducted in whispered conversations during the long winter months when outdoor work was impossible. But Eryndor's teaching extended beyond traditional healing into areas that would have alarmed their owners had they understood the true scope of her knowledge. Cherokee medical traditions included detailed understanding of plants that could heal or harm depending on dosage and preparation. Eryndor had learned these techniques from healers, who remembered when her people controlled vast territories from the Appalachian Mountains to the Great Plains. The knowledge she shared with Tavira represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about the relationships between plants, human physiology, and the delicate balance between medicine and poison. Tavira's position as head cook provided her with unprecedented access to information and materials. She was present during important business meetings, where ranch visitors discussed their affairs with the casual assumption that enslaved people lacked the intelligence to understand or remember what they heard. She had access to trade goods that passed through the ranch, including chemicals and compounds that arrived with supply wagons from distant cities. The kitchen staff that worked under her direction consisted of 3 other enslaved women and 2 hired helpers who came and went depending on the season. Lunara Feldrin, barely 18, possessed a natural talent for pastry work that complemented Tavira's savory cooking skills. Kalis Norwick, older and more experienced, handled the heavy preparation work that kept the kitchen functioning during busy periods. Dalis Veranor specialized in preservation techniques, managing the smokehouse and root cellar operations that sustained the ranch through winter months. These women formed a tight-knit community within the larger ranch population, sharing information and resources in ways that their masters never fully appreciated. They developed their own communication systems, their own methods of mutual support, and their own ways of resistance that operated beneath the surface of apparent compliance. The kitchen became a sanctuary where they could speak freely, plan collectively, and preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Tavira's daily routine began before dawn and continued until well after sunset. She planned menus that could accommodate sudden changes in the number of guests, managed food supplies that might need to last through unexpected shortages, and maintained equipment that had to function reliably despite the harsh conditions of frontier life. But these visible responsibilities concealed other activities that she pursued with equal dedication and considerably more secrecy. During her few hours of rest, Tavira conducted what she privately called her additional studies. She experimented with plant extracts, testing their properties and effects through careful observation and meticulous record-keeping. She developed new preservation techniques that extended far beyond food storage. She created detailed mental maps of the surrounding territory, noting the locations of specific plants and the seasonal patterns that affected their potency. Her quarters, a small cabin behind the main house, contained what appeared to be a simple collection of cooking supplies and personal belongings. But hidden compartments that she had carefully constructed contained her real treasures. Detailed notes written in a cipher of her own devising, samples of various plant extracts stored in containers that looked like common cooking ingredients, and equipment that served multiple purposes depending on how it was used. The cipher that Tavira developed was based on Cherokee syllabics that Eryndor had taught her, modified with her own innovations to create a writing system that would appear to be random scratches or decorative marks to anyone who didn't understand its logic. This allowed her to keep detailed records of her experiments and observations without risk of discovery, even if her quarters were searched. Her ability to read and write had been developed in secret, another skill that she concealed from her masters. The ranch's library, officially off-limits to enslaved people, became accessible to her through her kitchen duties. When she cleaned the main house, she had opportunities to study books on chemistry, botany, and medicine that provided scientific context for the traditional knowledge that Eryndor had shared with her. The combination of traditional Cherokee plant knowledge and frontier medical texts created a unique synthesis of practical wisdom and theoretical understanding. Tavira could identify plants by their scientific names, while also understanding their traditional uses in ways that neither Cherokee healers nor university-trained physicians could fully appreciate. This dual perspective gave her capabilities that were truly unprecedented on the frontier. The respect that she commanded within the enslaved community extended beyond her cooking skills. Others sought her advice on medical issues, relationship problems, and strategic questions about resistance and survival. She had become an informal leader whose influence shaped the daily life of everyone who worked the ranch, though she exercised this influence with the careful discretion that survival demanded. Her relationship with Eryndor Valecrest was complex, shaped by years of interaction that neither of them fully understood. He valued her skills while remaining oblivious to their true extent. He trusted her with responsibilities that demonstrated his dependence, while maintaining the legal and social structures that denied her humanity. She served him faithfully while harboring knowledge that could destroy him, knowledge that was growing more dangerous with each passing season. The tension between appearance and reality defined every aspect of Tavira's existence. She appeared to be the perfect example of an enslaved person who had found contentment within the system that owned her. She seemed grateful for the privileges that her position provided, respectful of the authority that governed her life, and dedicated to the welfare of the ranch that was her entire world. But beneath this carefully maintained exterior, she was conducting research that would have implications far beyond anything her masters could imagine. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, carried by a supply wagon that had made the 3-week journey from Kansas City through increasingly hostile territory. Tavira was preparing the afternoon meal when she noticed Eryndor Valecrest's unusual silence as he read the correspondence that had accumulated during the wagon's absence. His normal pattern was to share interesting news with whoever happened to be present, but this particular letter seemed to require his complete attention. The change in his demeanor was subtle, but unmistakable to someone who had observed his moods for 8 years. The slight tightening around his eyes, the way his fingers drummed against the table, the manner in which he folded the letter with deliberate precision rather than the casual gestures he normally used with routine correspondence. Something in that letter had shifted the balance of his world, and Tavira's survival instincts told her that this change would affect her life in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. That evening, after the hired hands had settled into their quarters and the other enslaved workers had retired to their cabins, Valecrest summoned Tavira to his study. The room smelled of leather, tobacco, and the oil used to maintain the firearms that lined the walls. Maps of the territory covered one wall, marked with colored pins that indicated property boundaries, water rights, and potential railroad routes. The desk was mahogany, imported from Louisiana before the war, made such luxuries more difficult to obtain. "Tavira," he began, using the tone that indicated serious business rather than routine household management, "I've received communication from my business associates in Missouri. There are opportunities developing that will require certain adjustments to our operations here." The careful euphemisms told her nothing specific, but the underlying tension in his voice suggested that these opportunities involved changes that would affect the lives of everyone on the ranch. Valecrest had a tendency to speak indirectly about matters that involved the buying and selling of human beings, as if polite language could disguise the brutal realities of his business practices. "The territorial situation is becoming more complex," he continued, moving to the window that overlooked the corrals where prize bulls were kept for breeding purposes. "Political developments in Washington are creating pressures that require us to be more flexible in our arrangements. Some of our people may need to be relocated to areas where their skills can be better utilized." The word relocated struck Tavira like a physical blow. In the carefully coded language of slavery, relocation meant sale to unknown buyers in distant territories. It meant the destruction of the community that had become her family, the end of relationships that provided the only stability in her controlled existence. But which people would be relocated? And why was Valecrest discussing this with her rather than simply implementing whatever decisions he had already made? "Your skills in the kitchen have not gone unnoticed by our visitors," Valecrest explained, still looking out the window rather than meeting her eyes. "There's significant interest in acquiring someone with your capabilities for operations in California, where the gold mining camps are creating new markets for quality food service. The compensation being offered would help finance expansion of our cattle operations here." The full implications of his words settled over her like a winter blizzard. She was being sold. After 8 years of faithful service, after building her reputation as the finest cook in the territory, after creating the very success that had made Thornwick Ranch famous throughout the region, she was going to be traded like livestock to finance Valecrest's business expansion. When would this relocation take place? She asked, her voice steady despite the earthquake that was shaking the foundations of her existence. The buyers will arrive in approximately 6 weeks, Valecrest replied. They're traveling from Sacramento with a group of other purchases, and Thornwick Ranch is their final stop before returning to California. You'll have time to prepare the other kitchen staff to handle operations in your absence. Absence. As if she would be returning from a vacation rather than disappearing forever into the gold camps of California, where the life expectancy of workers was measured in months rather than years. The polite fiction that surrounded these transactions was almost more insulting than the brutal reality they concealed. Will any of the other kitchen staff be included in this arrangement? Tavira asked, though she dreaded the answer. Lunara will accompany you, Valecrest confirmed. The buyers specifically requested a pastry specialist to complement your skills. The young woman's talents will be valuable in the mining camps, where men pay premium prices for reminders of civilization. Lunara, barely 18 years old, with skills that had taken years to develop, and a spirit that hadn't yet been completely broken by the realities of their situation. Tavira had been training her not just in cooking techniques, but in the survival skills that life in the territory demanded. Now Lunara would be thrown into an environment that would either destroy her quickly or transform her into something harder and more desperate than anything the frontier had yet produced. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering practical details about the transfer of kitchen responsibilities and the inventory of equipment that would remain with the ranch. Valecrest spoke as if he were discussing a business transaction involving machinery rather than human beings, with relationships, emotions, and attachments that would be severed by his commercial decisions. But beneath his carefully controlled exterior, Tavira detected something else. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe just discomfort with the necessity of explaining his actions to someone whose opinion shouldn't matter but somehow did. Their 8-year relationship had created a strange intimacy that neither of them acknowledged but both understood. He relied on her judgment, trusted her competence, and had grown accustomed to her presence in ways that complicated the simple master-slave dynamic. The buyers have an excellent reputation, he added, as if positive references could somehow mitigate the fundamental violation of selling people who had served him faithfully. They operate mining camp restaurants that cater to the more successful prospectors. You'll be working with quality ingredients and serving customers who appreciate fine cooking. The absurdity of his attempt at reassurance would have been amusing under different circumstances. He was trying to convince her that being sold into slavery in the gold camps represented a career advancement rather than a death sentence. The fact that he felt the need to provide justification revealed his own awareness that what he was doing was fundamentally wrong, regardless of its legality. When the conversation finally ended and Tavira was dismissed back to her quarters, she walked through the ranch compound with new eyes. Every building, every fence post, every familiar landmark now appeared different, transformed from home into temporary prison. The community that had sustained her for 8 years would be scattered by commercial decisions made in distant cities by men who would never know their names or understand their lives. The letter that had arrived that morning represented more than a business opportunity for Valecrest. It was a catalyst that would transform her from loyal servant into something far more dangerous. The system that had controlled her life was about to discover that some forms of knowledge, once acquired, cannot be contained by legal documents or commercial transactions. In her cabin that night, Tavira opened the hidden compartment where she kept her most precious possessions. The notes written in her Cherokee cipher, the samples of plant extracts that she had been collecting and refining, the equipment that could serve purposes far beyond cooking. For 8 years she had been preparing for a future that she couldn't define. Now that future had arrived, and it looked like war. The decision formed in her mind with the clarity of mountain water. If they were going to destroy her community and sell her like livestock, she would teach them that some property fights back. The knowledge that Orlith had shared with her, the skills that she had developed through years of careful study, the understanding of chemistry and botany that she had gained through secret research, all of it would finally serve its intended purpose. Eryndor Valecrest's 45th birthday was 6 weeks away. The celebration would draw visitors from across the territory, men whose decisions shaped the lives of thousands of enslaved people. It would be the perfect opportunity to deliver a lesson about the dangers of underestimating those whom you have decided to treat as property rather than people. The transformation of Tavira's hidden laboratory began the morning after her conversation with Valecrest, though to outside observers nothing appeared to change in her daily routine. She continued managing the kitchen with her usual efficiency, training Lunara and the other staff in techniques they would need after her departure, and maintaining the high standards that had made Thornwick Ranch famous throughout the territory. But beneath this surface of normal activity, she was conducting research that would have horrified anyone who understood its true purpose. The root cellar beneath the kitchen had always been her domain, the place where she stored the preserved foods that sustained the ranch through winter months. Its thick stone walls and constant cool temperature made it ideal for maintaining food supplies, but those same characteristics also made it perfect for storing materials that required careful environmental control. Behind barrels of pickled vegetables and shelves of preserved meats, Tavira created a workspace that would allow her to refine the techniques that Eryndor had taught her. Her mentor's knowledge of traditional Cherokee plant medicine provided the foundation, but Tavira's access to scientific texts through her cleaning duties in the main house library allowed her to understand the chemical principles behind traditional practices. The combination of indigenous wisdom and frontier medical knowledge created possibilities that neither tradition could achieve alone. The pest poison that was readily available around the ranch provided the starting point for her research. Used to protect stored grain from rodents and insects, it was considered so common that no one monitored its use or noticed when small quantities disappeared from the supplies. But Tavira understood that the active compounds in pest poison could be extracted, concentrated, and modified through processes that would make them far more dangerous than their original form. The extraction process required equipment that she fabricated from kitchen tools and supplies that were available without arousing suspicion. Copper pots used for candy making could be repurposed for distillation when combined with tubing from the ranch's brewing operation. Glass jars that normally held preserves became containers for chemical solutions. Even common cooking ingredients like salt and vinegar could serve as reagents in the purification process. The most challenging aspect of her research involved determining proper dosages and delivery methods. Traditional Cherokee knowledge provided guidance about plant toxicity, but the concentrated extracts that Tavira was creating were far more potent than anything used in traditional medicine. She needed to understand how these compounds would affect human physiology at concentrations that had never been systematically studied. Her test subjects were the rats that infested the grain storage areas, despite the ranch's pest control efforts. Through careful experimentation, she developed an understanding of how different concentrations affected animals of various sizes, how quickly symptoms appeared, and what physical signs indicated that the desired effects were being achieved. These experiments, conducted in the privacy of the root cellar during the early morning hours before the ranch awakened, provided crucial data about the properties of her refined compounds. The scientific texts in Valecrest's library proved invaluable for understanding the theoretical principles behind her practical experiments. Books on chemistry and medicine that had been purchased to demonstrate the owner's sophistication became textbooks for a course in applied toxicology that no university would ever offer. Tavira's ability to read, developed in secret over years of stolen opportunities, allowed her to correlate her experimental observations with established scientific knowledge. One text, a medical handbook published for frontier physicians, contained detailed descriptions of poisoning symptoms and their progression through various stages. Another book, ostensibly about agricultural chemistry, explained the molecular structures of common compounds and how they could be modified through simple chemical processes. A third volume, dealing with pharmaceutical preparations, provided formulas for calculating dosages based on body weight and other factors. The synthesis of this information with Eryndor's traditional knowledge created insights that neither source could provide independently. Traditional Cherokee medicine emphasized the importance of timing, seasonal variations in plant potency, and the relationship between preparation methods and therapeutic effects. Scientific chemistry explained why these traditional practices worked, providing the theoretical framework that allowed Tavira to optimize and improve upon ancient techniques. The specific preparation that she developed for Valecrest's birthday celebration represented months of careful refinement. The base compound was extracted from pest poison using a distillation process that concentrated the active ingredients while removing impurities that would affect taste or appearance. The resulting extract was virtually colorless and odorless, making it ideal for incorporation into food preparations. But the real innovation lay in her delivery method. Rather than simply adding the poison to individual dishes, Tavira developed a technique for incorporating it into ingredients that would be used throughout the meal. Flour treated with her refined extract would contaminate every baked item. Sugar similarly processed would affect all desserts and sweetened preparations. Even salt could be modified to carry measured doses that would accumulate as guests consumed multiple courses. This approach offered several advantages over simpler poisoning methods. The effects would be delayed, allowing the entire meal to be consumed before symptoms appeared. The dosage would be distributed across multiple items, making it nearly impossible to identify the specific source of contamination. Most importantly, the gradual accumulation of toxins would create a situation where some guests would be affected more severely than others, depending on their individual consumption patterns and physical characteristics. The psychological impact of this selective toxicity was as important as the physical effects. When some people at a gathering become ill while others remain healthy, despite eating from the same dishes, it creates a level of uncertainty and fear that simple mass poisoning cannot achieve. Survivors would never again be able to approach a meal with confidence, knowing that apparent safety could mask deadly danger. Tavira's understanding of human psychology, developed through years of observing the ranch's guests, informed every aspect of her planning. She knew which foods would be most popular with different types of visitors, which dishes would be requested in larger portions, and which items would appeal to specific individuals based on their known preferences. This knowledge allowed her to target her preparations with surgical precision. The timing of the birthday celebration, scheduled for early December when weather would prevent quick departure from the ranch, created additional advantages for her plan. Guests would be trapped by winter conditions, unable to flee or summon outside help when the effects of her preparations became apparent. The isolation that usually protected Valecrest from external interference would become a liability that intensified the impact of her revenge. As the weeks passed and the birthday celebration approached, Tavira maintained perfect normalcy in her interactions with Valecrest and the ranch staff. Her behavior showed no indication of the deadly preparations that occupied her private hours. She discussed menu planning with enthusiasm, ordered special ingredients from distant suppliers, and demonstrated the same attention to detail that had always characterized her work. But in the hidden laboratory beneath the kitchen, she was creating something that would transform a birthday celebration into a final judgment. The pest poison that had once protected the ranch's grain supplies would become the instrument of justice for crimes that no court would ever prosecute. The knowledge that had been preserved through generations of Cherokee healers would serve purposes that those ancestors could never have imagined. The irony was perfect. The same system that had reduced her to property would discover that property could possess knowledge and capabilities that made it more dangerous than any conventional weapon. The birthday cake that was meant to celebrate another year of successful exploitation would become the delivery system for a lesson that the frontier would never forget. December 3, 1852 dawned clear and bitter cold across the Colorado Territory, the kind of crystalline winter morning where every breath created clouds of vapor and the frozen earth rang like iron beneath boot heels. Tavira had been awake since 3 o'clock, moving through the pre-dawn darkness of her kitchen domain with the methodical precision of a general preparing for battle. Today was Eryndor Valecrest's 45th birthday, and by sunset, the celebration would transform into something that would be whispered about in frontier settlements for generations to come. The guest list for the birthday celebration read like a directory of frontier power. Territorial Judge Malvin Caraith had arrived the previous evening, accompanied by his entourage of legal clerks and political hangers-on. Railroad Surveyor Drevin Thorsell had ridden in from the Eastern Territories, with maps and contracts that would reshape the entire region. Cattle Baron Sylvan Maurice had brought his sons and business partners from ranches scattered across 3 territories. Even Governor Kaylor Vinrath's personal representative Therick Corvan had made the arduous winter journey to attend what promised to be the social event of the frontier season. These men controlled the economic and political future of thousands of square miles of territory. Their decisions determined which areas would be developed, which populations would be displaced, and which forms of labor would be utilized to extract wealth from the wilderness. They were the architects of a system that reduced human beings to property values and measured progress by the efficiency of exploitation. Today, they would discover that their assumed immunity from consequence was as fragile as morning frost. The kitchen hummed with controlled activity as Tavira orchestrated the preparation of what would appear to be a culinary masterpiece. Lunara worked beside her, unaware that this would be their final collaboration before both of their lives changed forever. The young woman's skills with pastry and decoration had reached a level that rivaled anything produced in the finest restaurants of St. Louis or Chicago. Her artistic talents, developed under Tavira's patient guidance, would today serve purposes that she could never have imagined. The menu that Tavira had designed represented the pinnacle of frontier cuisine, each dish carefully selected for both its appeal to the guests and its suitability for her hidden purposes. The main course featured prime beef from the ranch's prize cattle, prepared with herb crusts that would mask any unusual flavors. Wild game birds stuffed with dressing made from the ranch's own grain would provide variety for more adventurous palates. Vegetables preserved from the autumn harvest would demonstrate the kitchen's skill at maintaining quality throughout the harsh winter months. But the centerpiece of the meal, both literally and strategically, was the birthday cake that had occupied Tavira's attention for the past 3 days. 3 layers of the finest vanilla cake, made with flour and sugar that had been transported across hundreds of miles of wilderness at enormous expense. The frosting was a masterwork of frontier baking, smooth and white as fresh snow, decorated with roses and scrollwork that transformed a simple dessert into a work of art worthy of the finest Eastern establishments. The modified ingredients had been incorporated with surgical precision throughout the meal preparation. Flour treated with her refined extracts went into the bread, the cake, the thickening agents used in gravies and sauces. Sugar similarly processed, sweetened the desserts, and provided flavor balance in savory dishes. Even the salt had been enhanced with compounds that would accumulate as guests consumed multiple courses, creating a delayed reaction that would allow the entire meal to be enjoyed before its true nature became apparent. The timing of the celebration followed frontier social customs that worked perfectly for Tavira's purposes. The formal dinner would begin at 4 o'clock, allowing sufficient daylight for the elaborate presentations that demonstrated the host's wealth and sophistication. Multiple courses would be served over a period of 3 hours, ensuring that guests would consume substantial quantities of the enhanced ingredients before any symptoms appeared. The evening's entertainment, planned to continue well past sunset, would trap the guests at the ranch when the effects of their meal became unmistakable. As the afternoon approached, Tavira found herself entering a state of heightened awareness that she had never experienced before. Every sound seemed amplified, every color more vivid, every sensation more intense. The weight of 8 years of accumulated anger and frustration had crystallized into a clarity of purpose that eliminated doubt and hesitation. She was no longer simply an enslaved cook preparing a meal. She had become an instrument of justice, a teacher whose curriculum would deliver lessons that conventional education could never provide. The guests gathered in the main dining hall at precisely 4 o'clock, their conversations filling the room with the sound of masculine confidence and casual authority. These were men who shaped the destiny of the frontier through financial power and political influence, who discussed the buying and selling of human beings with the same detached interest they showed for cattle prices and railroad schedules. Their expensive clothing, imported from Eastern manufacturers, marked them as representatives of civilization imposing order upon wilderness. Judge Carafe dominated much of the early conversation, regaling the assembled company with stories about territorial law and the challenges of administering justice in regions where federal authority remained largely theoretical. His tales of frontier courts and vigilante justice were received with the appreciative laughter of men who understood that real power came from controlling resources rather than appealing to abstract principles of law or morality. Railroad surveyor Thor Sell displayed maps that showed proposed routes connecting the mineral wealth of the mountains with the agricultural productivity of the plains. His technical expertise commanded respectful attention from men who understood that transportation infrastructure would determine which of their investments would prosper and which would become worthless. The conversation around his maps involved millions of dollars in potential profits and thousands of jobs that would reshape the entire regional economy. Cattle Baron Morwenne and his associates discussed market conditions, breeding programs, and land acquisition strategies that would consolidate their control over vast areas of grazing territory. Their plans involved displacing native populations, redirecting water resources, and importing additional enslaved labor to handle the expanded operations that railroad access would make profitable. The casual efficiency with which they planned these disruptions revealed how completely they had internalized the notion that their desires took precedence over the rights or needs of anyone less powerful. Tavira observed these conversations from the kitchen doorway, her trained ears cataloging information that would have been valuable to resistance movements if any had existed in the territory. But her purpose today transcended intelligence gathering. She was preparing to deliver a more direct form of communication, a message that would be impossible to ignore or misinterpret. The first course was served at 4:30, consisting of soup made from the ranch's prize cattle bones, enriched with vegetables from the preserved harvest, and seasoned with herbs that Tavira had cultivated specifically for this occasion. The guests praised the complexity of flavors, the careful balance of seasonings, and the skill required to create such sophisticated cuisine under frontier conditions. Their appreciation was genuine, based on standards that reflected extensive experience with fine dining in established cities. The second course featured the wild game birds, accompanied by dressing made from grain that had been treated with Tavira's enhanced flour. The presentation drew compliments for its artistic arrangement and the innovative techniques used to preserve the birds' natural flavors, while adding complementary elements that demonstrated the cook's creativity. Several guests specifically requested that their compliments be conveyed to the kitchen staff, unaware that they were praising the very person who was orchestrating their destruction. As the meal progressed through successive courses, Tavira monitored the consumption patterns of individual guests with the attention to detail that had always characterized her work. Judge Caraith showed a preference for the seasoned beef, consuming larger portions than his companions. Surveyor Thorsell favored the game birds, requesting second helpings that would increase his exposure to the treated ingredients. Cattle Baron Morwenne sampled everything but concentrated on the bread and preserves that would deliver precisely calculated doses of her refined compounds. The birthday cake was presented at 6:15, carried into the dining hall on a silver platter that reflected the candlelight like a mirror. The three-layer masterpiece drew gasps of admiration from guests who had not expected such artistry in a frontier setting. The decoration represented hours of painstaking work, with hand-piped roses and intricate scrollwork that transformed a simple dessert into something worthy of the finest Eastern establishments. Eryndor Valecrest made a brief speech, thanking his guests for making the journey to share his birthday celebration, acknowledging the hardships that winter travel imposed, and expressing appreciation for their friendship and business relationships. His words carried the satisfaction of a man who had achieved everything he had set out to accomplish, who controlled vast resources and commanded respect throughout the territory. He had no awareness that his trusted cook was delivering a final judgment on his life and legacy. The cake was distributed with ceremonial formality, each guest receiving a generous portion that would ensure adequate exposure to the concentrated compounds that Tavira had incorporated throughout its preparation. The first bites were consumed amid enthusiastic praise for the cake's texture, flavor, and artistic presentation. Guests who had dined in the finest restaurants of New York and Philadelphia declared it equal to anything they had experienced in those sophisticated establishments. The consumption of the birthday cake marked the culmination of Tavira's carefully orchestrated plan. The accumulated doses from multiple courses had achieved the precise levels that her research had indicated would produce the desired effects. The timing was perfect, the weather conditions ideal for trapping the guests at the ranch, and the psychological impact would be maximized by the contrast between the celebration's apparent success and its true nature. As the guests finished their cake and moved toward the parlor for evening entertainment, Tavira retreated to her quarters with the quiet satisfaction of work completed according to plan. She had transformed years of secret study into a practical application that would deliver justice where conventional systems had failed. The knowledge that Orlith had shared with her, combined with her own innovations and research, had created something unprecedented in the territory's history. The first signs of distress would appear within the next 30 minutes, beginning with the oldest and most physically vulnerable guests, before progressing to those with stronger constitutions. The celebration that had been designed to demonstrate Valecrest's success and influence would become a testament to the dangers of underestimating those whom the system had reduced to property rather than people. The first scream pierced the evening air at exactly 6:47, cutting through the gentle murmur of after-dinner conversation like a blade through silk. Judge Malvin Carraith, who had been regaling his companions with tales of territorial jurisprudence, suddenly doubled over in his ornate chair, his face contorting with an agony that no amount of legal authority could alleviate. The silver brandy snifter tumbled from his trembling fingers, its contents spreading across the Persian carpet like spilled blood in the flickering candlelight. Tavira heard the commotion from her quarters, where she sat calmly mending a torn apron with the steady hands of someone whose work was finally complete. The sounds drifting from the main house told her everything she needed to know about the progression of her carefully orchestrated justice. The refined compounds were working exactly as her months of research had predicted, beginning with the most vulnerable targets before moving systematically through the assembled representatives of frontier power. Within minutes, the elegant parlor had transformed into a scene that would haunt the nightmares of any survivors for the remainder of their lives. Railroad surveyor Dravan Thorsell collapsed beside the fireplace, his carefully drawn maps of territorial development scattered around him like the fragments of dreams that would never be realized. The technical expertise that had made him valuable to railroad interests now meant nothing, as his body rejected the birthday celebration that he had traveled hundreds of miles to attend. Cattle Baron Sylvan Morich staggered toward the main entrance, perhaps hoping that fresh air might provide relief from the mounting distress that was overwhelming his system. His sons, who had accompanied him on this journey that was meant to strengthen business relationships and political connections, followed their father's desperate example. But the winter night offered no sanctuary from the consequences of decades spent treating human beings as livestock to be bought, sold, and disposed of according to market conditions. Eryndor Valecrest, the birthday celebrant whose 45 years of life had been marked by the systematic exploitation of everyone less powerful than himself, experienced the effects more gradually due to his robust constitution and larger physical frame. This cruel mercy allowed him to witness the destruction of his guests while understanding that he too would soon join them in their final accounting. The recognition in his eyes when it finally came carried a weight of comprehension that transformed the master of Thornwick Ranch into something far more humble. The household staff who had not been involved in food preparation watched in horrified fascination as the territory's most powerful men were reduced to helpless victims of forces beyond their control or comprehension. The hired hands, summoned by the sounds of distress, found themselves confronting a crisis that no amount of frontier experience had prepared them to handle. Some attempted to ride for medical assistance, but the nearest physician was 3 days away, and the winter weather made rapid travel impossible even under the best circumstances. Lunara, who had worked beside Tavira in preparing the fatal feast, began to understand the true nature of the evening's events as the pattern of illness became unmistakably deliberate. Her mentor's unusual calmness throughout the day's preparations, the careful attention to specific ingredients, the precise timing of each course, all of it suddenly revealed its hidden significance. The young woman who had trusted Tavira's guidance in developing her culinary skills now realized that she had been an unwitting participant in something that transcended ordinary revenge. The surviving kitchen staff faced a terrible dilemma as they watched their masters and their guests succumb to the effects of their own birthday celebration. Years of conditioning had taught them to seek help for their owners during medical emergencies, but the same system that demanded their loyalty had been systematically destroying their lives and families. The moral complexity of the situation created paralysis among people who had never been allowed to make decisions of such magnitude. Governor Kaylor Vinrath's representative, Theric Corvan, managed to maintain consciousness long enough to dictate a message intended for territorial authorities. His political training allowed him to recognize that what was happening at Thornwick Ranch represented more than a tragic accident or isolated incident. The systematic nature of the poisoning suggested planning and knowledge that challenged fundamental assumptions about the capabilities of enslaved people. His final official act was to warn his superiors that they were facing something unprecedented in territorial history. The winter storm that arrived during the early hours of December 4th trapped everyone at the ranch, creating a natural quarantine that prevented both escape and outside intervention. The hired hands, who might have fled to spread news of the disaster, found themselves snowbound with the evidence of their masters' final judgment. The isolation that had always protected Thornwick Ranch from external oversight now became a prison where survivors had to confront the full implications of what had occurred. Dr. Fendrel Caro, a traveling physician who had planned to continue his journey the following morning, found himself conducting what amounted to a mass autopsy under conditions that made systematic investigation nearly impossible. His medical training allowed him to recognize signs of deliberate poisoning, but the sophistication of the delivery method and the precise targeting of specific individuals suggested knowledge that contradicted everything he thought he understood about the intellectual capabilities of enslaved people. The physical evidence of Tavira's expertise was overwhelming for anyone with the training to recognize it. The selective nature of the poisoning, which had affected only the most powerful guests while sparing the household staff and hired workers, demonstrated an understanding of dosage calculations and delivery methods that would have impressed university-trained chemists. The delay between consumption and symptom onset showed planning that took into account the social rhythms of frontier hospitality and the psychological impact of mass casualties. But Tavira herself had vanished into the winter landscape like smoke from an extinguished fire. Her quarters revealed nothing more incriminating than the normal possessions of a frontier cook, though careful examination might have detected the subtle modifications that had transformed common kitchen equipment into chemical apparatus. The root cellar showed signs of recent activity, but the specific nature of that activity remained mysterious to investigators who lacked the specialized knowledge needed to understand what they were seeing. The search for the missing cook began immediately, despite the hampering effects of the blizzard that had settled over the territory. Tracking dogs brought from neighboring ranches lost her scent within hours, their confusion suggesting that she possessed knowledge of techniques for concealing her trail that exceeded anything known to frontier law enforcement. The vastness of the Colorado wilderness provided countless hiding places for someone familiar with the terrain and prepared for winter survival. News of the Thornwick Ranch massacre spread through the territory's scattered settlements with the speed that only truly shocking events can achieve. Trading posts, military outposts, and neighboring ranches received reports that grew more sensational with each retelling. But the core facts remained consistent enough to create widespread alarm among anyone who relied on enslaved labor. The comfortable assumption that such people were incapable of sophisticated resistance had been shattered in a single evening. The territorial government's response revealed the extent to which the entire power structure depended on the fiction of willing servitude among the enslaved population. Emergency sessions convened in Denver and other administrative centers, but the officials who remained alive found themselves paralyzed by the implications of what had occurred. How do you maintain control over people who have demonstrated the ability to strike back with such devastating effectiveness? Military commanders throughout the territory received orders to increase surveillance of enslaved populations, but the practical implementation of such measures proved nearly impossible given the integrated nature of frontier society. Enslaved people worked in kitchens, handled livestock, maintained equipment, and performed countless other tasks that required access to tools, materials, and information that could be weaponized by someone with sufficient knowledge and motivation. The psychological impact on the region's slaveholding class exceeded even the immediate casualties of the birthday celebration. Families who had relied on enslaved cooks for years suddenly found themselves unable to trust the very people who prepared their daily meals. Some attempted to replace enslaved kitchen staff with hired workers, but qualified candidates were scarce and expensive, making such arrangements economically unsustainable for most operations. The medical community struggled to understand how such a sophisticated poisoning could have been carried out by someone without formal training in chemistry or medicine. Dr. Caro's official report to territorial authorities acknowledged that the attack demonstrated knowledge and planning capabilities that challenged existing assumptions about the intellectual limitations of enslaved people. His recommendations for preventing similar incidents essentially amounted to admitting that the current system was fundamentally vulnerable to this type of resistance. Railroad development plans for the territory were immediately suspended as investors reconsidered the safety of operations that depended on potentially hostile local labor. The surveying work that Draven Thorsell had been conducting represented millions of dollars in planned infrastructure development, but his death and the circumstances surrounding it created uncertainty that made financial backers reluctant to proceed with such ambitious projects. The cattle industry throughout the region experienced a crisis of confidence as ranch owners realized that their operations depended entirely on people who might possess knowledge and motivations that could destroy them at any moment. The isolation that had made large-scale ranching profitable by reducing oversight and regulation now became a liability that exposed owners to risks they had never considered. Some enslaved people throughout the territory began disappearing from their assigned locations, though whether they were fleeing in fear or seeking to connect with networks inspired by Tavira's example remained unclear to authorities. The underground communication systems that had always existed among enslaved communities suddenly appeared more threatening to masters who had previously dismissed them as harmless gossip and social interaction. Local newspapers struggled to report the story in ways that wouldn't encourage similar acts of resistance while still acknowledging the magnitude of what had occurred. The territorial press had always portrayed enslaved people as childlike dependents who required the guidance and protection of their masters. But the sophistication of the Thornwick Ranch attack made such characterizations impossible to maintain with any credibility. The winter of 1852 to 1853 became known throughout the Colorado Territory as the season when the comfortable illusions of frontier life finally confronted the reality that oppression creates enemies who possess intelligence, patience, and capabilities that their oppressors never bothered to recognize or understand. The birthday celebration that was meant to demonstrate the success of territorial development instead became a warning that some forms of progress come with prices that the architects of exploitation never considered. In settlements scattered across hundreds of miles of wilderness, enslaved people heard whispered accounts of what had happened at Thornwick Ranch. The details varied with each telling, but the central message remained consistent. Someone who looked like them, someone who had been dismissed and underestimated, had proven that knowledge could be more powerful than chains, that patience could be more effective than rebellion, and that justice could be served, even when conventional systems failed to provide it. The search for Tavira Morwenne continued through the brutal winter of 1853 and into the spring thaw, but she had vanished into the Colorado wilderness as completely as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Federal marshals brought in from Denver, military tracking units from Fort Collins, and even Pinkerton agents hired by desperate ranch owners all failed to locate the woman who had transformed a birthday celebration into the most significant act of resistance in territorial history. Her disappearance was so complete that some began to whisper she had never existed at all, that the Thornwick Ranch massacre was the work of outside agitators or foreign agents rather than a trusted kitchen maid. But in the hidden communities that had always existed on the margins of frontier society, Tavira's story took on dimensions that transcended historical fact. Cherokee settlements in the mountain valleys preserved accounts of her collaboration with Orlith Danavar, adding her name to the oral traditions that honored those who had used traditional knowledge to resist oppression. Escaped slaves in remote mining camps shared techniques attributed to her teaching, methods for identifying useful plants and extracting their essential properties that bore remarkable similarity to her documented innovations. The network of safe houses and underground communication routes that had operated secretly throughout the territory suddenly became more active and sophisticated. Messages passed between settlements with increased frequency, carrying information about plant identification, chemical extraction, and application methods that suggested someone was continuing Tavira's educational mission. Kitchen workers on ranches hundreds of miles from Thornwick reported mysterious illnesses among particularly cruel overseers, though the symptoms were always mild enough to avoid fatal outcomes while delivering unmistakable warnings. Dr. Fendrel Caro, whose medical expertise had revealed the sophistication of the original attack, spent months documenting similar incidents throughout the Colorado Territory and neighboring regions. His private journals, discovered decades later, recorded over 40 cases of suspicious poisoning between 1853 and 1857, each showing hallmarks of the advanced knowledge that Tavira had demonstrated. The pattern suggested that her techniques had been systematically shared and adapted by others who had learned to transform traditional plant medicine into instruments of resistance. The territorial government's attempts to prevent the spread of Tavira's methods proved counterproductive, creating exactly the kind of attention and documentation that preserved her story for future generations. Official restrictions on enslaved people's access to certain plants only confirmed that such plants were significant, while prohibitions against traditional medicine practices drove those practices deeper underground, where they evolved beyond government oversight or control. The economic impact of the Thornwick Ranch massacre extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Railroad investment in the territory declined precipitously as Eastern financiers reconsidered the wisdom of major infrastructure projects in regions where local labor might prove unreliable or actively hostile. The cattle industry experienced fundamental changes as ranch owners shifted toward hired labor systems that were more expensive but perceived as safer than depending on enslaved workers for essential operations. By 1855, the enslaved population of Colorado Territory had decreased by nearly 30%, not through formal emancipation, but through the practical decisions of owners who concluded that the risks outweighed the economic benefits. Some enslaved people were sold to markets in other territories, while others simply disappeared into the wilderness following routes that seemed to have been established for exactly such purposes. The frontier economy, which had depended on unpaid labor for its profitability, began adapting to wage-based systems years before the Civil War made such changes mandatory. The psychological transformation was even more profound than the economic effects. The comfortable assumptions that had allowed frontier society to function despite its fundamental contradictions could no longer be maintained after Tavira's demonstration of what was possible when intelligence, patience, and specialized knowledge combined with sufficient motivation. Ranch owners who had never questioned their safety in the presence of their enslaved workers now found themselves unable to eat meals prepared by people they had reason to fear. The legend of Tavira Morwenne grew with each retelling, acquiring details that may or may not have been historically accurate but served important functions for the communities that preserved her story. She became a symbol of hidden knowledge and patient resistance, proof that apparent powerlessness could mask capabilities that would surprise and overwhelm those who assumed their superiority was permanent and unassailable. Cherokee communities throughout the region incorporated her story into traditional teachings about the relationship between knowledge and responsibility. The plant wisdom that she had learned from Orlith Danavar became part of a broader curriculum that emphasized the potential consequences of sharing powerful knowledge with those who might use it for purposes beyond traditional healing. Her example demonstrated both the possibilities and the risks inherent in preserving and transmitting dangerous information. African American communities that developed after emancipation preserved different versions of Tavira's story, emphasizing her role as an educator who had proven that enslaved people possessed intelligence and capabilities that their oppressors never recognized. Her techniques became part of a broader tradition of resistance knowledge that included everything from navigation skills for escape routes to communication methods for coordinating collective action. The medical community eventually recognized that the Thornwick Ranch incident represented a sophisticated understanding of plant chemistry that predated formal scientific documentation of the compounds involved. Tavira's extraction and concentration methods, reconstructed from evidence found at the ranch, revealed techniques that wouldn't be systematically studied by university researchers until decades later. Her work represented a unique synthesis of traditional knowledge and innovative methodology that produced results far ahead of contemporary scientific understanding. Modern forensic analysis of preserved samples from the Thornwick Ranch investigation has confirmed the remarkable precision of Tavira's dosage calculations and delivery methods. The selective nature of the poisoning, which affected only the intended targets while sparing others who consumed the same foods, demonstrated an understanding of human physiology and chemical interactions that would be impressive even by current medical standards. The site of the former Thornwick Ranch, now within the boundaries of a Colorado state park, bears no official marker acknowledging what happened there in December 1852. But local guides who lead hiking tours through the area sometimes share sanitized versions of Tavira's story, presenting it as an example of frontier justice without dwelling on the specific methods she employed. The ruins of the ranch house foundation are visible among the cottonwood trees that have reclaimed the former grazing land, their broken stones serving as an informal monument to a confrontation between oppression and resistance that changed the trajectory of territorial development. Historical societies throughout Colorado maintain archives that document the official response to the Thornwick Ranch massacre, but the most important records were never written down. The knowledge that Tavira represented was preserved through oral traditions, practical demonstrations, and community memories that passed from generation to generation without leaving paper trails that could be monitored or suppressed by authorities. The broader implications of her story extend far beyond the specific circumstances of frontier slavery. She represents the universal principle that oppressive systems create their own opposition by concentrating knowledge and motivation in ways that eventually overwhelm the mechanisms designed to maintain control. Her example demonstrates that resistance can take forms that oppressors never anticipate, using tools and techniques that appear harmless until they are employed with precision and intent. Today, botanists studying traditional plant medicine in the American West occasionally encounter techniques for extraction and concentration that seem remarkably sophisticated for their historical context. Chemical analysis of traditional preparations sometimes reveals processes that suggest advanced understanding of molecular interactions and biological effects. The scientific community generally attributes these discoveries to the accumulated wisdom of indigenous traditions, but researchers familiar with Tavira's documented innovations recognize signatures that point to her continuing influence on traditional medicine practices. Her story serves as a reminder that knowledge itself is a form of power that can be preserved and transmitted even when other forms of resistance become impossible. The techniques that she developed and shared represented more than individual rebellion. They constituted a form of education that empowered others to make their own choices about justice and survival under circumstances where conventional options were unavailable. The kitchen where Tavira perfected her methods no longer exists, but the principle that she represented continues to inspire those who understand that patience, knowledge, and careful planning can accomplish what direct confrontation cannot. Her legacy lives on in every instance where the overlooked and underestimated prove that apparent powerlessness can mask capabilities that reshape the world in ways that those in authority never saw coming. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.